How far is too far in Christian fiction? Today we talk sex, language, and violence with author and host of the Right Stuff radio show, Parker J. Cole. Welcome again to the Christian Arts and Entertainment Podcast. My name is Kevin Newsom, your host. Thank you for being here, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening to the podcast. I have with me today author and podcast host Parker J. Cole. Welcome, Parker. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Would you take a moment and tell all of our viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself, about your podcast, about your books and writing experience, and anything you want to say?
What I like to say is that I am a recovering Mountain Dew and marshmallow addict who writes to fill the void the sugar left behind. That's what I would like to say. What I do write, I primarily write romance. I write sweet historical and sweet contemporary romance. I'm also writing speculative fiction under a pen name. And I podcast. As a podcaster, I showcase Christian authors worldwide and have been doing it now for almost 8 years.
Excellent. Well, I asked you on here because we're going to talk about the big question: how far is too far in Christian fiction? We're talking about sex, violence, language, stuff that my books have come under fire for. So my books are actually, a lot of people would consider them Christian horror. And there is violence against women in the first book and violence against the act of living in most of the other books. And some mild language, but it's mostly violence. I tell everybody it's PG-13 because of violence. I wouldn't call them Christian horror, but I have come under fire, especially from the established conservative Christian base that you find in most of your conservative churches, that someone in ministry shouldn't be writing stuff like this. So it's an ongoing debate. It's an ongoing topic. It's every conference you're going to have people talking about this. How far is too far? So let's just get into it. What are your initial thoughts on it?
When I hear that there are things too far, I have to wonder, do people live in the world that we live in today? Do they live in a different world, or do they live in a separate one? Do they live a world where there's unicorns and rainbows and chocolate sprinkles falling from the sky? Or do they live in a world that's fallen? People who are sinners, people who need to be saved by grace. Do you truly believe that we are here to evangelize people who are lost? Whether you're a regeneration or whatever, do you really believe that? If you really believe that, then to say that something is too far is to act as if, well, you shouldn't talk about it. But these are things that's happening in real world USA or real world, wherever you are today. There are people who are dying right as we speak. There are people who are being raped. Right as we speak. There are people who are being sworn at right as we are speaking today. So to say, oh, you shouldn't talk about it in your fiction is to kind of put the veil on what's happening in the world today. One of the reasons why the church is under attack a lot is because we have forgotten what we are supposed to do, which is to evangelize. Now, most of us who are writers, we evangelize through our writing. And in today's world, I can be in Michigan. I'm in Detroit, Michigan. I could be in Michigan and I could connect with someone in Thailand. I connect with someone in China. I could connect with someone all over the world through my books. And so I want to often have that bit of realism in my story. Some people say, well, if it's Christian fiction, it should be whitewashed. I totally don't agree with that. Now, if you are writing to a certain market, that's different. Like my market, my readers, they like sweet historical stuff. However, I'm writing under speculative fiction too, and I tend to want to write a little bit grittier, a little bit wilder, because that's what I like. I grew up with sci-fi. I grew up watching sci-fi monster movies. Me and Granny, that's what we watch. Our love for sci-fi comes from her. So I have to really challenge the people who say that. Do you live in real world today? And if you live in that, how dare you say that some things are too far?
Yeah, my response was when people were challenging me about the violence in my books, I would just simply say, have you read the Bible?
Exactly.
Have you read
Exactly.
how much violence in my books are tame compared to what happens, say, in the book of Judges, which
Exactly. I
is
was
an
thinking about that too.
extremely violent and bloody book.
Yes.
But you're right. As Christians, we have the responsibility to not to whitewash stuff, but to put light on the truth, to shed the light on truth. And truth is not. We're not talking about the truth of the gospel and the truth of God
Right.
and the objective truth. We're talking about the truth of life, the truth of
Yes.
reality, the truth of the human condition. To shed the light on the truth of the human condition and to share what the hope of Jesus is through showing the truth. And it's something that people like Stephen King in his book on writing, Anne Lamott, Bird by Bird, that they harp on. Tell the truth. If you're going to write a story, tell the truth. And we tend to, I don't know, Christians kind of want to shy away from that.
I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a debate, because people say you're supposed to be in the world but not of the world. But that's the caveat there. You are in the world. And so in this world, you're dealing with all sorts of people. There are people who live in situations that are horrifying. I don't know, recently, for example, I read a really sad article about this guy who cut open his wife's stomach because he was so desperate to find out if his wife had a baby boy. Now, it was in India, and that's where women are seen as second-class citizens. They're
Mhm.
not really important. And he already had 5 daughters. He was so desperate to see if he had a son. So he cut up his wife's stomach. I wonder what the Christian message would do then. Maybe if I could write a book where women are elevated like Christ, or show how the Bible elevated women, how Jesus elevated them, maybe that would help have him see a mind there too. But again, this is real world. This is stuff that's happening right now today. This didn't happen 10 years ago. This happened, I think, last week. Okay, so when you say is Christian fiction too far, then you kind of saying like, well, if it's too far, then what are we? Then when do we put the brakes on everything? Now, mind you, I will also say this: there are some people who don't want to read that stuff. And
Right.
I understand that. So it does come to preference too. That's something we can talk about in a minute, okay? But I understand that. But to tell someone, well, you shouldn't have this in your story, you shouldn't. Why? Because it happens for real, and so it shouldn't be in our story. Are we responding to the needs of the world? Or are we responding to our own closeted orb of influence that we have there?
So let's accept the fact that we need to tell the truth. We need to display reality in our fiction, but there's lots of different ways to do that.
Exactly.
You can talk about violence and sex without being graphically detailed. I mean,
Or gratuitous, exactly.
right.
Hmm.
For fiction writers, we're extremely powerful. We can paint whatever picture we want with words more vividly sometimes than people can with a photograph, because we can get into the inner person and what they're feeling and experiencing, where a photograph can't really do that.
Hmm.
Um, so, as Christians, how do we write these things?
See, and this is where I may fall into the minority of things, because I have read Christian books that have had explicit sex scenes in it, but they weren't so sexy where you were like, oh my gosh, reading erotica. I've had some readers just kind of, if I'm using sex for right now, 'cause that's a big one. Like I write in romance, and that's a big thing, right? And so
Right.
they have what they have behind closed doors. So it may start with a kissing scene and then close the door. That way you can just imagine what happened. I have some people who've written in romance, again, they kind of show what's going to happen, then they close the door. And then some people go all out, because some people have the mindset, guess what? People have sex. We
Right.
wouldn't be here if we didn't. So there is that. So, and then when it comes to violence, like I've read some violent books where what they try to do is minimize like gory details. So in one of my books called Dark Cherub, which is my very first book, it was actually what I would call Christian horror. And I didn't know there was a Christian horror genre when I first wrote it. I thought I was coming up with something new. And then I looked
Right.
up, well, we've been doing this for a while, like Frank Peretti,
Right.
Decker, some of
Big,
those people.
huge influence Frank Peretti
Who's,
has on me. Yeah.
I mean, Frank Peretti, he's Godfather, all that stuff. But anyway,
Yes.
so in Dark Cherub, I have a rape scene, but the way I describe the rape scene is from the supernatural presence that's watching these events. And so instead of making it really gratuitous, I made it tragic, but I use again, in the book, I use from that point of view where the scene calls the girl who's being raped the rabbit. and the guy, the wolf, I think it was. I can't remember now because I don't look
Yeah.
back. I hope I've grown so much as a writer since then, so I don't look back. But there's that rape scene, but I try not to be gratuitous. And I actually had someone say, "I'm glad you didn't make it so gratuitous," stuff like that. When it comes to violence, you can be gritty without being gratuitous. You can be violent even without being vicious, if you will. There are ways to do that. I will also suggest some craft books that people can get to help them. Recently, I don't know if you know her. I think her name's Carla. She just wrote a fight book about things. You can get craft books from there. You
Uh,
can.
Carla Hooch.
Yes, thank you. That's her
Yes.
name. She just wrote the fight book, and I picked it up myself, and it's highly informative. But I can't throw
I'll
a
uh,
punch,
I'll,
so
I'll reference that for those who are watching, listening that want to find out
yeah,
more about it. I'll reference that in the show
yeah,
notes.
yeah. And she shows you, about body injuries, stuff like that, and you can use that information to help build up a better fight scene. Just a lot of craft books help you because you don't always want to be like, blood pouring and
Hmm.
guts hanging out, unless it's part of your story too. You have to be true to the story too.
And
If
you got to
guts
know
are
your
hanging out,
audience. You got
yeah,
to know your audience.
that's a
Oh,
factor. That's a huge factor.
right. So, yeah, I did in my first book, and I really didn't think a whole lot about it until my wife said something about it. There's a ritualistic rape that
Hmm.
happens
Hmm.
in my first book, and it's completely off scene. You
Hmm.
don't see it at all. You see the after effects of it.
Hmm.
And my wife is like, you know what, your first book is more intense than any other ones because of this.
Yeah.
And I find that a lot of times it's not so much what you're describing in the moment, it's the mental game, it's the emotions and the mentality that makes it more horrible than what actually happens. So I've got another pretty intense scene in my third book where it's completely happening on the other end of the phone, and it's only for like one paragraph, and she hangs up the phone. But to me, that is one of the most horrific moments in any of my books
Hmm.
because it's all mental. It's all mental. If you're controlling the person's mind, and then you can take them just about anywhere you want. I tease it. I like to lead my readers around by the nose and control the way they think.
Well, that's what horror does. Horror is not really, it's not torture porn. Like Saw was like, let's not
Right.
torture porn. Horror is like messing with your head game, And I always think about, if I was caught by a bear. I'm terrified of bears, and I'm
Yeah.
like, if it was me running, an 8-year-old kid running, the horror is that do I run, kick this kid over, and let the bear get him and save me, or do I try to help this kid? Mind games, So yeah,
Right.
totally get that.
Right. So into some specifics, we've talked about sex. What about and a little bit about violence? What about language? How do
Yeah.
we as Christians handle language? I mean, obviously, it's at the end of the day, it's just words, but there's a difference between the vulgar and just swearing in general.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I tend to see a lot of Christians will use the lighter swear words sparingly, but they'll stay away from the vulgar.
Hmm.
What are your thoughts on language?
What's fascinating to me, and that swearing is almost worse than violence for some Christian readers. Like
Yes.
you can have a violent story. You say you have violence against women in your book, right? You can have that. They'll be like, okay, that happens. But if you say the F word or the D word, and it's like, oh, you made this horrible sin. I'm like, oh my gosh, really? And I always think about judges. I always think about judges when I think about violence because he cut her up, and
Right.
sent her out to everybody, right? And then, but when you say swearing, well, you can't do that. You should not have swearing in your book. You're looking like, you gotta go like, this is a problem for you, So for me, I am a diplomat when it comes to this because some people have very strong convictions about swearing. So I always suggest you do what's comfortable for you as an author. What's comfortable for you? Like me, I don't have a problem with swearing in books. I just don't. I mean, because I grew up reading all sorts of books, and I was reading Stephen King when I was a kid. I was hiding from my mom, but I was reading
Right.
him when I was a kid. My mom was like, when she's like, you can't read him. Of course, I'm going to read him now. You know what I'm saying? So I used to. I won't say that, but and then I started reading romance, and I wasn't reading the sweet romance. I didn't know they existed till what 10, 12 years ago. So
Right.
it's like I read all that stuff. So maybe that's why I have such a wide palette for things. But for those with the language stuff, you can either go with your convictions, and honestly, because some readers you can have no words at all, and someone's still going to be mad at your book because they, oh,
Right.
it's not realistic enough. Like I always think about if I'm writing an urban romance, let's say, about gang members and stuff, they aren't saying fiddle dee dee. They just aren't. Okay. Can you
You know, I
imagine a
had
rough
a
tuck? Yeah.
I had a scene in one of my books where there was this, this confrontation between somebody and somebody was going to get hurt, and one character had a gun and she hesitates, and the other character smashes the guy over the head, and it's so intense, life or death. My editor said, saying darn in this situation just doesn't fit.
Like fiddlesticks,
Yeah.
like really?
Yeah, next time, pull the darn trigger, you. So no, it's not telling the truth. That's where we
Yeah.
get back to telling the truth. That's not what would have been said in that moment. It's not realistic.
Yeah, and that's why that's why I said for me it's not it for me, and I have to go me. It's not a big deal. But like some people, they use like, oh, he swore, he cursed,
Mm-hmm.
curses gargled up from his throat, or it's always man because never women that talk like that, and so stuff like that. So for me as an author, I would go with your convictions. If you want to create your swear words, I've seen authors do that, create swear words they can. I did a workshop, if you don't mind mentioning it, Kevin. I did a workshop when I was with SoCal a couple years back where I talked about how swearing can actually give detail about the character. And I used an example
Mm-hmm.
from one of my girlfriends who writes historical romance. The girl was formerly enslaved. And so her language was different than the guy she fell in love with, who had been free all his life. And so when she talked to him, her language was much more coarser than his language would be. And so
Right.
here you're using words to denote character development. And
Right.
as she began to know him more, what happens? Her language started to change. And so people just see swearing as you just trying to just swear. I said, no, it can be a character development too. Like, let's say a person who swears a lot, over time they may not swear, or a person who always keeps stuff in and don't say it and try to be nice and fake, they start to swear, they just say it. Like, you know what, this is full of whatever. Okay. And so instead of seeing that as something wrong, see, how can I use this to develop a character? How can I use it to tell a story?
Right. We mentioned Frank Brady earlier, who we all say is the godfather of Christian
Mm-hmm.
speculative fiction.
Mm-hmm.
He only did this in one book, in the Prophet, I believe it was.
Okay.
Very, very creative way of handling swearing. His main character would just describe it in a roundabout way, and very made an impact on me. I remember one. He said he was talking about the guy's boss. He said that he mumbled something about the sacredness of cow manure.
But see,
and we all
that's
know
back in the
what was
day too.
said. We
Yeah.
read between the lines, and he didn't have to write it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's the thing too. As we live in a society that's post-truth society, you have to meet people where they are.
Right.
And a lot of people think when they read Christian fiction in general, they think, oh, Christian fiction is Jesus fiction. Okay. And not that there's nothing wrong with that, please understand. But they haven't listened to either of our shows because we know the huge plethora of ideas in Christian fiction. And so to always have this safe route doesn't necessarily reach your reader. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Right.
you can't always play it safe.
Right. So we got this whole range of readers, and the audience in Christian fiction is so big. How do we navigate all of these books?
Mm-hmm.
So as a parent, I'm looking for middle grade YA Christian fiction for my daughter to read. But at the same time, I also know that most of the writers that I'm connected with think like this. And I don't know how far they're leaning as far as gratuitousness goes. How do we, there's no rating system. How do we navigate this?
Well, let me back up with your last question, with your last thought. You said there's no rating system. There are rating systems starting to come out when it comes to Christian fiction, but I think it's all subjective because you can use TBA as was one rating system, and they want it completely whitewashed. Okay. Can't sin a little, can't sin a lot. They can't have crisis of faith. They have crisis of faith. They got to, stuff like that.
Wow.
When it comes to parents, I have to say go with your convictions, because like me, almost like you can't really enclose your kid in a bubble,
Right.
because what you're trying to raise your kid, someone else isn't. So you can't enclose your kid in a bubble. So for me, because I don't have children, so I am coming from a certain sect of people who don't have kids. That I don't want them, but so I don't have kids. So I think about my godsons, think about my nephew. Do I want them reading my books? And I'm fine with it. That's how I think. I'm fine with my kids reading my books. Yeah. Would I want them to be too reading it? Of course not. Would I want them to be a little bit older? Yeah. You see what I'm saying? So that's one
Mhm.
thing to do it. And then also heard from different parents. I shared a snippet on my Facebook one time of a scene where the guy kissed a girl, and one parent was like, "That's too much for my 13-year-old daughter." And I thought it was whitewash as possible. So it's up to the parents what they do. I'm not going to tell a parent what they can't do, but at the same time, maybe as a parent, maybe you could become that YA person you want to be. Why you can become it. They say, "Well, I can't write a book." Well, anyone can write. You can
Right.
become that person. There's one lady who I just interviewed on my show, Wendy. Wendy Spooner. She wrote a YA, very clean YA, still has nice little, romantic stuff to it, but not, over the top. So, as people start to market toward that sect, you'll get more readers for that. Am I answering the question right, Kevin? I hope I
Yeah,
am.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so.
You are, and I would add to it that
Mhm,
our kids are going to get exposed to this stuff
mhm,
anyway. They're going to
yeah,
go to the library and pick up a secular written book. They're going to read Percy Jackson, Harry Potter, and Artemis
mhm,
Fowl, and they're going to read all of these things, and they're going to watch secular television and YouTube channels, and not to mention what they get exposed to in public school. They're going to get exposed to these things.
mhm,
Um, to give them a book written by a Christian that deals with the same things that they're already getting exposed to from a Christian perspective, to shed light on it, even in a broken world, and to give hope where there's darkness. I think it's something that we need to do more of, and we shouldn't
exactly.
worry so much about what's in the book and worry more about what is the worldview of the writer who is writing the book, and what is the worldview that is being presented in the book,
Mhm.
and what kind of worldview do we want our children exposed to, and
Yeah,
expose them to the
but I
right
think
kind
you
of
need.
stuff.
I think too, you should, that's where apologetics come in at, and I'm an advocate of apologetics too, is that you should start at a young age teaching your children that everyone's not going to believe the same thing you believe, but this is why we believe what we believe and why it's true. And so that's why you can't just assume that your children aren't going to ask these questions. A lot of kids ask questions when they're very, very young. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if you know about Ken Ham. He did this report from
Yes.
Answer Genesis. He did a report to they're already gone at 12. They're already gone. He
Right.
said they're already left the faith at 12. So what were they thinking about when they were 7? What were they thinking about when they were 6 when things happen? So the earlier you get involved into your children's life and start exposing them, not necessarily to the visual stuff, but talk to them about it. Talk to them about, God, talking about people who are different. Like, if I may, I just saw an article yesterday of this guy who got tattoos all over his face and he got his whites of his eyes turned black, right? He looks like creepy. And he's a kindergarten teacher, for goodness sake. And he says, I just want to teach the kids not to be racist and homophobic. And he's sitting there going, but you look scary. And some of the children
Right.
were scared. Some of the children got scared. So they said he couldn't teach. But that was his solution, was to make himself look like a freak. And
Right.
he was going to teach the kids not to do that. I said, so that's the worldview of,
Right.
of that. So that's the worldview. So what would be the Christian response to that? That people are going to look different from you. Do you have to do that to do that? No. And he said, well, most of the kids are used to it. Really? And you kind of think like what you do now, affects kids. So that's what I'm saying. So you can't wait till they get to school. You have to do it before that
Right.
happens.
Right. Uh, so we're coming down to the end of this. Uh, or do you have any last thoughts you want to share with listeners and viewers before we wrap this up?
First of all, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. Hope that your
Welcome.
podcast goes far. You get lots of downloads, viewers, and can't wait to reciprocate in the coming year. The other thing too is that I think when it comes to Christian fiction should not always be safe fiction. Christian fiction should be answering and dealing with the questions of the world. Christian fiction should
Right.
reach out to those who are dealing with hard questions. Like right now, people were in, we were stuck in this pandemic. People were isolated. People were alone, and things have happened in this pandemic that are going to have large and long-reaching effects on people. Should we just act like it didn't happen, or should we respond to that? Bible says go into all the world and preach the gospel. And the reason why the Lord said that, because people need answers to their questions. You may not be able to be a missionary for whatever reason, but you can use your writing as a missionary. I'll never forget, Kevin, I wrote my first romance called Many Strange Women. And Many Strange Women, the main character is a woman who hates herself. And I was there. I hated myself. I had a huge self-hatred of myself. And it wasn't anything my parents did. It wasn't anything that my sisters did. I just hated me because I thought, because I'm a big girl, I'm fat and this, and you get bullied as a kid, and so you hate yourself. And it's still something I fight with now. And in the book, the Lord had me write, I'm beautiful because the Lord created me. And he made me beautiful. And when he paid a price for my sins, he paid, if you want to use a term, and it's the one girl who told me this, she said, $5 million for a salt shaker. He said, that's like you're a salt shaker. Would you pay $5 million for a salt shaker? And you're like, no, right? No, I wouldn't pay $1 for it, And then she was like, but God paid $5 billion for you, and because he wanted you that much. And so I wrote this in the book where I said, I'm beautiful because I'm created by the Lord. And I had a woman reach out to me. She said, oh my goodness, I needed to hear that. And so I came from my own experience of hating myself to, having the Lord constantly work through me, because I said it's something I constantly deal with even now, many years have passed since then. I still deal with that low self-esteem issues and stuff. So imagine whatever you're dealing with as a fiction writer, what are you dealing with that you can help someone? Are you dealing with past abuse, past pain, hurt, divorce, lost your job, kids acting crazy, grandkids going crazy? What are you dealing with that you can reach somebody else out there? Sickness, chronic illness, chronic pain, crazy people working with. What can you do to help not make your Christian fiction so safe, but it can be relatable to people and what people are having in the world today, the problems they have in the world today?
Right. Once again, write what you know.
Mm-hmm.
What you know, write truth. All right, Parker, we're going to leave it right there, and I think that we've got another subject that we're going to tackle in the future. So I'll have Parker back on at a later date to handle that topic. Thank you all who have been watching on YouTube. Thank you all who have been listening through the podcast. I hope you have been informed and blessed, and that this helps you as writers and helps you as readers to navigate Christian fiction. Thank you once again, Parker. And thank you all for being here. Bye. This has been the Christian Arts and Entertainment Podcast with author, musician, and worship pastor Kevin Newsom. Thank you for joining us today, for your comments, and for subscribing. See you next time.